the City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Award, the B.P. Nicol Chapbook Award, and the Dorothy Livesay Prize. Please welcome Roy Miki and Larissa Lai.
Roy and I have agreed that we'll just do a little preamble-y sort of thing each, and then come back to the chairs. So I've prepared a little. It's a sort of very open-ended statement that I call "Remembering the Ruckus, Making the Present: 20 Years of Writing Through Race." The mid-90s were such an energetic time for Canadian cultural race politics that it's hard to pin down the complexity of it all. Smaro, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Sorry, I'm kind of feeling, yes, still overwhelmed, but happy and forgetting things. Thank you. The mid-90s were such an energetic time for Canadian cultural race politics that it's hard to pin down the complexity of it all. Very different things, I'd suggest, were happening in different communities, or even in the same communities, imagined through different frameworks at different historical moments. I've tried to write about this a little bit in that book that Smaro just mentioned, Slanting Eye, Imagining We, but I really do feel the book just scratches the surface. Today, I think by way of starting conversation, what I'd like to do is lay out 3 ways of thinking about the conference, its moment, and its import for the present. So the first frame 1, is the controversy frame. So frame 1, controversy. The first part, the part of our lives that lives on in the mainstream imagination, is the quote-unquote ruckus, or the so-called controversy, marked in the mainstream press by the idea of the exclusion of whites. The manufacture of this scandal has its correspondent, though non-identical reality, in a conference policy that limited daytime events to participations by self-identified First Nations writers and writers of color. The rationale behind this policy was to create, for a limited time, a little space for those racialized and excluded by Canadian writing community and publishing industry to talk about the issues affecting them without having to attend to white guilt or recrimination. It's reframing, and I would argue that it is a reframing, as the exclusion of whites, produced in the mainstream forum, precisely a public space that was all about that guilt and recrimination. Very few of the voices and concerns affecting Indigenous writers and writers of color hit the mainstream forum at that time. So you guys will remember this. I'm sort of recapping a little for those who, don't remember or weren't there or were very young when it happened. The scandal escalated when Reform Party member Jan Brown decried the conference as one that used public funds to run a racist conference. Right? Remember that? How could we forget if it was, if your memory was operational in that time? It came about through a broader, arguably manufactured, reactionary outcry that concluded with public funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage being withdrawn. Key voices bewailing the exclusion of whites were those of Robert Fulford and Michael Volpe. The one key voice arguing in the Globe and Mail for the original framing, one of inclusion and giving voice, was Roy Miki. There's an analysis that I've made in this book, and also for those of you who might be interested in the Writers' Union magazine that's called Write. And there I argue that the outcry was deployed as part of the rollout phase of a neoliberal economics set beside a politics of so-called common sense to shut down progressive anti-racist analysis that depended on a politics of the body and an insistence on writing from a broad range of marginalized locations that were just forming and beginning to find spaces to speak in that moment. Okay, so that's one frame, is this sort of mainstream controversy frame. And then the second frame I call something like intercommunity struggle, power imbalance. One of the hardest things I experienced during the organizing of Writing Through Race, and during the 1990s in general, was tension among artists, writers, and activists, variously identified through a range of names: First Nations, Indigenous, Coast Salish, Cree, Anishinaabe, Musqueam, Mohawk, Black, Caribbean, African, Asian, South Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, queer, GBLTQ, feminist, crip, disability, and more. These were simultaneously the names of our empowerment and the names of our oppressions. They were also names in tension not just with whiteness, but through and against each other. These names, of course, are attached to complex histories, communities, and forms of embodiment, attached to both real and perceived limits in the number of voices that could be heard, histories of racial hierarchy, both inside and outside the Canadian state, the relative capacities for voicing historical traumas in a range of forums, both mainstream and more community-based. The mainstream press lumped this broad range of differences, tensions, and alliances under the single term color, which made the articulation and working out of those differences and tensions all the more difficult and painful. We needed solidarity, but we also needed language and enough goodwill to talk differences and power imbalances through. At the end of the conference itself, these differences manifested as differences between those members of the organizing committee who were members of the Writers' Union and those who were not, and revolved around the issue of whether or not to bring an official report of the conference back to the union. I perceive a measure of retreat to national and/or racial categories in the aftermath. Some of the positive work of those critiques, of those retreats, include for me the clarification and growth of a powerful Indigenous sovereignty movement. For me, at present, identification as a racialized settler and the work of respectful alliance building seems to be important work. Specifically, I think that those of us so-called multiculturals who gained entry to state belonging through the agitation for rights need to remember and really deal with the fact that those rights were achieved within the frame of the colonial state, and that we thus must be accountable to and respectful of those disenfranchised by past and ongoing colonialism. So that's the second frame. And the second frame does relate to the third frame because I think that, the work of, we talked about it in the last panel, but of articulating difference while still doing solidarity work is the core of both of these, both frames 2 and 3. So frame 3, friendships, conversations, ongoing. To counter the tension I recognize in frame 2, I'd like to offer its flip side, which is that the conference Writing Through Race and the organizing that surrounded it also gave birth, thinking about Lillian Allen's poem this morning, also gave birth to many friendships, writing relationships, books, and discussions that are ongoing to this day. These are harder for me to speak about, strangely, because this is sort of the quote-unquote positive side. They're harder to speak about because they're personal and doubtless specific to each of us involved. For me, in my 20s at the time, these were formative years. They made entry into writing life and cultural life more broadly possible. The ideal emphasized at that time of the need to write from one's own historical and embodied position was key. It opened the doors for a located, experiential practice of writing, which also became a practice of relating to others, other writers and other cultural producers for sure, but also to a community that was forming itself through this ideal. In practice, this meant a rush of memory and location at once freeing and painful, and a practice that connected those who engaged it to one another in profound and infinite ways. I actually really appreciate the naming of events that Shani Mutu did this morning. I remember many of those events, and they were indeed, they were enjoyable. They were hooked to the practice of pleasure. At the same time as I think they did profoundly political work. So, okay, I carry most of my important friendships forward from that time. I remember the writing group that Shani Mutu, Monica Kingagnon, and I had. And I remember drinking wine, eating veggie burgers, and talking about first and second books with them up in Shani's Granville Street apartment. I've retained strong friendships with many people. I almost don't dare name them for fear I've forgotten people, but Roy Miki, Fred Wah, Hiromi Goto, Rita Wong, Aruna Srivastava for sure, and their list expands out kind of ad infinitum from there. You know, Susan Crean, Lillian Allen, Lee Maracle. And seeing you all today, you know, it's bringing it back in a rush. My work remains work that is in conversation with these friend colleagues. It wouldn't be possible without them. I think this is true of many of us, often revolving around different and overlapping circles of people. The discussions that took place in writing collectives, artist-run centers, libraries, small presses, progressive magazines, and many more were formative of relationships and discussions that, to my mind, were profoundly democratic and profoundly creative. The danger is that they may get lost in these hyper-bureaucratic and institutional times. I hope not, and I hope that our work today of remembering and re-evaluating might bring back and/or bring to the surface the history and energy that has always been there, available for us to access any time. All we need to do is attune ourselves to have the then of it and the now of it, always a little bit differently. Yeah, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thing to say. I try to make things up as we go. Writing through race is something that occurred a long time ago, and a lot has happened since then. But one of the things that has always mystified me living in this country called Canada and being constituted through its particular regulatory systems that we call the educational system. And understanding, as far as I can, since I was a little kid in Winnipeg, growing up in central Winnipeg around Logan Avenue, trying to understand the relationship of individuals who get marked in various ways through their bodies and the administrative and discursive systems that attempt to regulate them into different modes of citizenship. Those of us who have been, and this goes back to writing through race, those of us who have experienced, thankfully or not, systems of racialization come to know in our consciousness that there are different realities that function within the visible systems that we experience every day. That there is, in fact, at particular moments in history, regimes, what I call regimes of, what theorists call regimes of visibility, where certain people come to reify certain systems of power and other people take their positions within hierarchic relationships. And every time you try to make visible these systems of power, the entire social system gets riled up. And it's not very difficult to watch this system light up like a map by throwing a wrench into it. And Idle No More was a wrench. And as I hope I'll talk about, Writing Through Race was a wrench as well. And the things that we come to understand is when the system lights up, then what I discovered was the people who are in systems, who are occupying dominant relations of power. And in Writing Through Race time, it was the media that took offense. But they immediately rise up and take offense by what is being done in the name of democratic systems. And in this case of Writing Through Race, when our policy hit the news waves, of course it was translated immediately into the systems of dominant discourse. So what Larissa talked about as writers self-identifying as writers of color, or First Nation writers self-identifying, and that meant that there are people who could have passed their entire lives as white writers, came to the conference because they self-identified as a writer of color. And it was a self-identification that was very, very important. It was an element of respecting individuals' self-perception of the kind of identities that constituted them as citizens of this country. Well, the dominant institutions translated that subtle kind of self-identifying as white exclusion. So within a moment, a turn, the conference that we had labored to organize through careful committee meetings over a period of months went out, all that organizing and that subtle thinking and critical thinking went out the window, and suddenly we became the target and we became the enemy. And I remember that turn, I got a phone call at that time when the federal government decided to pull the plug on our funding. I got a phone call from Minister of Multiculturalism, Sheila Feinstein. And she said to me, change the policy and we'll give you the money. Just like that. We'll change the policy and we'll give you the money. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, let whites attend the conference. And I told Sheila Feinstein, I said, Sheila, or Madam Minister, I'll let you know one thing that will be absolutely certain, that whiteness will be in the room. And she says, that's not what I mean. I said, you mean white identified bodies coming into the room. I said, you know what? You will find those bodies there as well. I said, because they will be there because they're self-identifying. And who's to know who's who in any given audience? And I said, but what you're doing is asking us to go back on our commitment to writers, to communities, and so on. This policy was set up specifically to depolarize the binaries and to allow for one weekend a small amount of time for individual writers to speak their minds about what it means to write. And I said, whiteness will definitely be in the room. And I said, there are a lot of people who are of mixed background. I said, what about them? Are they white or are they of color? She had no answer for these kinds of things. And she phoned, and then her executive director phoned me a few times, but we never got anywhere on that policy. So they pulled the plug on that. It was about 12,000 or something like that, or 15,000. And then there was Michel Dupuy, the Secretary of State. He got up in the House of Commons when he was challenged by Jan Brown to pull the plug on Writing Through Race. He said, I am profoundly against all forms of discrimination. You see, is this in that? I am profoundly against all forms of discrimination. He never thought to think about what systemic discrimination means. He was the Secretary of State. And his office phoned, and I reminded them that this conference actually fitted into the mandate of the Charter of Rights, even though we weren't using it, and the Multiculturalism Act, that in fact he ought to be defending the conference, not opposing it. And he capitulated. And it was a very sad moment for me, being a good Japanese-Canadian kid who grew up nurtured on notions of critical democracy, the notion that one could actually change systems through political action. And I get a little emotional about this because the system got betrayed. Sorry about this. I shouldn't break down.
It's okay. Everything is embodied.
Yeah, I'm too idealistic for my own good, I guess. But I said to the ministers, I couldn't talk to the minister. He wasn't available for speaking to me, but his directors were. And I said, you guys are making a huge mistake that you will pay for, because you are betraying the very system that you propose to uphold. Now, they pulled the plug too, so we lost 22,500. And the reporter phoned me up that day and he says, what are you going to do now? Just like that. What are you going to do now? I said, I don't know. He says, is the conference going to go ahead? I don't know. Do you think you're going to get this money? I said, I don't know. In fact, if I told you right now that the whole conference was a construct and that it was never meant to occur, could you write about that? Would that make a very interesting story to you at this moment, that you can go back to your editors and say that the coordinator of this conference just said that the conference was never meant to occur because they knew, in fact, that the government would pull the funding, that we had already second-guessed that. And of course, we didn't get anywhere, because at that point in my organizing, I was very angry with the fact that we had gone through this whole system of grant writing. I mean, those of you who have written grants know you're begging for money. It's just kind of humiliating at times. The pittance that you're asking for and the amount of hoops you have to pass through just to satisfy some bureaucrat in Ottawa who's looking and said, those people of color, they want $15,000 to meet in Vancouver. Should we give it to them or not? No, I don't think so. Somebody at the top says, I don't think so. We've given them enough money this year. Anyway, the conference went on because people and this room is filled with people. That's why I kind of broke down, because I've been, fortunately or not, I'm not sure. I'm just see myself as one part of a whole complex of movements. And I've been really fortunate to be able to grow up in this nation with writers and artists from all across Canada who have participated in things and have invited me to conferences and who have conversed with me on various kinds of things. And I think there's people like Susan Crean, and I could mention others, who came forward and started the fundraising going. And within days, I think 3 or 4 days, we had $35,000 coming in and more. And in fact, we could invite more writers of color because of the funding. It wasn't only 150. We actually had 180. We could write to the 80 that we had refused funding to, that they could now come. And the conference went ahead of 3 days of really. Well, I didn't enjoy myself, I had to say. Everybody else partied day and night. Especially I hear on English Bay, there were lots of late-night parties, and people dragged themselves to these whites excluded sessions and yacked their hearts out for 3 days, and there were readings at night. And I think what I want to say is, in retrospect, one of the things that moved me the most about this conference was the kind of pedagogical stakes that it raised in taking control of the way in which we understand literature, the way we write literature, and the way we study literature. The challenge that the committee followed through on in Writing Through Race was to create an alternate provisional fly-by-night institution because the universities had let us down in 1994 completely. There were no writers of color, First Nations writers being studied in any of the Canadian literature courses I ever saw. And if a non-white writer got taught, it was at the very end. The teacher would say, oh yeah, and there are these minority writers, so we should have a little class on them now. And that was about it. And what we wanted to do was change the structure of the discussions and have our own conference. I know I'm going a little bit too far, just a few more minutes. But let me just go from that moment, which I think is an interesting pedagogical paradigm that might still work today if we can take control of the means of production in the educational process and educate ourselves and retrain ourselves and transform our own discourses. Because terminology is always a system of power. And it's important not to get trapped by the closures that they impose on our thought and our consciousness. And I like that George Eliot Clark mentioned that the larger structures that we have to deal with is the whole structure of Western civ itself and its imperialistic forms. And I must thank the Aboriginal scholars and leaders and activists and artists and poets who today raise the question of large forms of reconciliation and large forms of justice. Because what it's doing is bringing home to rest again once more in our consciousness the challenge that to decolonize ourselves, in fact, we have to undo the very discourses and the very legal systems and the constitutional systems and all of the whole historical paradigms that we've inherited. We have to undo them all in order to see a way beyond territorialization as we have it in Canada today, and the Constitution as we have it today, and, of course, capitalism as we have it today with its obsessive relationship to extracting all the natural resources from the land, which has become private property and territory. And that's the larger challenge, I think, that's waiting open for us. And so let me just close by thanking the organizers here and all of you for letting me ramble a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but I have a lot more to say, but maybe in the question period we'll talk about it a bit more. Thank you very much.
I suppose of a lot of the analysis we were doing, so we recognized, the need to recognize specific material history. It's really important to attend to the ways in which forms of embodiment are called into being through, Judith Butler would say, reiterative material practice. In other words, the way that we inhabit our lives, right? So what we do, there was a little bit of discussion this morning about the everyday. I think, Cecily, that came from you. You were asking Lenore about the everyday and about survival on the everyday. That was part of it. Yes. I'm going to turn it a little bit, but I think it's connected. So that sense of the way that we're called into our embodied beings on a daily basis through all of these institutions of power, whether it's the police or the people on the street beside us or the people in the ivory tower beside us, our colleagues, our students, all of that sort of call that sort of embodied being. And all of that stuff has shifted. Analysis has deepened. It's become more specific in a good way. And I think it opens the possibility then for thinking about alliance making in even deeper historical and material specificity. So I guess I am talking, George isn't here anymore, but it was very kind of him to talk about my book, that Foucauldian notion of genealogy, right? That we look to all of the possibilities that were there in prior historical relationships that didn't necessarily serve the state or capital, and so aren't in the history books, aren't necessarily pulled up into the present. But we can, right, reach in and pull them up. If we need to do the research, we need to go into the archive to find them, and then they can be drawn up and drawn back into the service of revolution, right, the service of relationship, the service of coalition building. So is that new language? It's new language and it's old language. But it's work to do in relationship to build or to build again.
One of the things that came across to me when you gave us the 3 ways in which you tried to make sense of writing through race and that period is that I don't think you're talking only about the coalition of people of color or indigenous people coming from different cultural spaces. One of the things that I remember, and to me that became very obvious in the Race is Sexy festival or conference, I don't know what it was called. I was there, I still have the t-shirt actually, that says Race is Sexy. It was a coalition of different discourses and art forms and media, yes, which was happening in a very powerful and dynamic way. So it was not just a matter of crossing spaces in terms of culture, race, or language, but also through the language of different art forms that I found extremely powerful. And I think that Shani made a point that kind of echoes that especially I remember the first time I saw your work, Shani, was at Race is Sexy, your visual work. You had a couple of videos there, I remember, yeah. So, and then I discovered she was also a writer, so it's, you know, it was that, I found that to be a very productive way of developing different kinds of means and voices to speak to and against and through the systemic issues of power.
Yes, that's right. And I think that also that, you know, a lot of the important critical work that happened in and through writing through race is related to the important critical work that happened through ANPAC. And remember that Caspar and I were talking about it at lunch. Remember that ANPAC was dissolved around a set of, this is the National Association of Artists and Artist-Run Centers, something like that. And a lot of the debates were parallel, and then they materialized in slightly different ways because of the forms, like the aesthetic forms were different. And then I think the other thing that's really important to pull out of your comments, to return to Shani again this morning, is the question of sexuality, right? So embodiments aren't just, we're not just called into racial or cultural or linguistic being, we're called into sexual being, we're called into gendered being. And I think that there are profound interactions among those forms of embodiment in the same body on a daily basis, right? That that could stand further theorizing.
Yeah, in part, how would I talk about that? What's going on today? I'm concerned about the way liberal discourses have covered over the history of violence in Canada directed towards minority groups and First Nations groups. There's anti-terrorism legislation that is just coming out now that sounds suspiciously to me like the old War Measures Act in a new dress, redressed, we might say. And there's the move within the federal system to appropriate historical nodes of the formation of the settlers, Canada as a settler state. And there's a militarization of Canadian history that I find very disturbing. And even though our corporate capitalists tell us that we've gone beyond history, and there is a side of the federal government, federal state, that is attempting to go post-historical in relation to historical injustices through their national, what was called their National Recognition Program. How many of you know about that program that ran from 2006 to 2010? One or two of you, yeah. He's probably studied it in a class somewhere. But it's not well recognized, but during those 4 years, $25 million was granted to a number of ethnic organizations, Ukrainian Canadian organizations, Jewish Canadian, Italian Canadian, Chinese Canadian, and they were all, the monies were earmarked for particular recognition projects that memorialized particular historical injustices in Canada. and then memorializing them, in a way put them to bed. And after that period, the government had in a sense, washed its hands of the historical dimensions of the Canadian state. So that there's that side, and that's like what I would call a neoliberalization of our everyday lives. The assumption that the only thing that matters is what's happening, flitting through my consciousness at this particular moment, as long as I keep buying the products and the commodities that will keep feeding the engines of this voracious capitalist system, which, by the way, is not only hiccuping, but it's bankrupting itself in various ways. Capitalists will say, capitalism will never end. But we have seen the end of it, and it's not bad. The dropping oil prices, and everybody's so worried about that, and our dependency on fossil fuels and so on. There's a lot of changes that are going to happen, and it's only a matter of time before we begin to start thinking about different means of production that are non-capitalist, and begin deterritorializing private property, another thing, gain another sense of the commons, and all this different kind of language that I see coming out of the mouths of a lot of activists today that comforts me, and it's a way of speaking back, I think, to things that we don't always see, because neoliberalism invisibilizes everything. It's like you don't really see how power is functioning, because in part the invisibilization of power is the way in which power functions the most effectively. And we think power is always working through us, down on us, but power flows, as Larissa might say, through our bodies. It is transmitted through our bodies, and it manifests itself in what we do, how we act, how we treat each other. And my hope would be that we would begin to develop a language in which we practice justice. Not to hope for justice to come, but if we be just in our own actions, then it will demonstrate itself. But I think the time is coming. We have a much better language, I know, to talk about power, micro elements of power, and about aggregations of bodies and what that means, and class analysis and gender analysis. So we have a lot more complicated language to deal with the micro elements of these relationships and these concepts. But what we need to do still is learn how to practice them and how we can make them manifest in our everyday lives and what we do. But anyways, that's something we might think about further.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor to questions. Here, second row.
Roy, and this is addressed to both of you. You mentioned the anti-terrorist legislation that sounds a lot like the War Measures Act. Yeah. And I think of Stephen Collis, who had his poem read in court as evidence, I guess, of his character, his obstructive intentions. I just wondered if you could speak to the potential, the danger, I suppose, of being put on a list or watched because of our writing, because of this kind of writing, if that is part of what has changed as far as writing about race in this moment versus 20 years ago.
The War Measures Act had those key words: peace, order, and good government. And if anyone was seen to harm Canada in terms of its peace, order, and good government, you could then be incarcerated without being put on trial indefinitely. And this is what happened to Japanese Canadians, of course. They were detained for 7 years at the pleasure of the Minister of Justice. And what that means is the new anti-terrorism legislation means that if someone is seen to be subversive of peace, order, and good government, I don't think they use those words, but they use other words that are very equivalent, which means a poet like Steve Collis, and he's a good friend of mine, could actually then be seen as both subversive and maybe destroying the peace or the order of government and so on, and be seen as a terrorist. He'd be part of a security risk. Then could be termed a terrorist and be incarcerated without cause and without being placed on trial, without being charged.
The other part of your question, Sonnet, addressing the problem of surveillance. I mean, I think that's really something, we need to be attentive to. I don't know what we do because they legislate us into filling out the forms, giving our names, our bios, all of that kind of stuff. And then we participate on Facebook and Twitter and all of that anyway. And so, all of the things that have come to light with the Edward Snowden and all those revelations, I mean, it really is sobering, isn't it? In that sense of the extent to which we're being watched. And, that the Nazi Party kept lists too, right? And then the other part of your question, which is so interesting, is this question of Steve Collis's poetry being read in a court of law as evidence of character, because it also says something about the instrumentalization of creative practice, the instrumentalization of literature for something that literature was never really, meant to do, was never meant to work at in that kind of way. It's the way that it engages with language, the kinds of spaces and communities through which literature is supposed to move. It's not supposed to be the same kind of language as courtroom language, right? It's not legal language. It doesn't do the same kind of social labor. And so to see a poem of Steve Collis's brought before the court as evidence of character in some kind of way seems to me to be the most profound misuse of literature I can imagine. And I think that the work that we as writers and as critics and as artists in this room need to be doing is to insist on and fight for all the multiple nuanced, possibilities in the broadest possible sense that literature has traditionally have. It should continue to have. It becomes very dangerous actually when it's sort of. I'm all for repurposing usually, but not for something like that. It's a great question.
My name is Jael, and I am the artistic director for a new festival that's coming next year called The Fold, the Festival of Literary Diversity, and it's being held in the magical land, faraway land of Brampton. I just have a question. One of the conversations we've been having today is about real diversity, like on that complex level. I think diversity as a movement is kind of cool and sexy right now, and so there is that it gets attention and support very easily. But I just wondered if you had advice for us as a team on how we can make sure that the diversity component goes much deeper and much richer than just the visual appeal of being diverse and being amongst something diverse. And so I was just wondering if both of you had thoughts about what to include and what to be aware of and what to think about as a team.
Well, you might start by thinking very carefully about. I mentioned this staging of a pedagogical moment in Writing Through Race, that you might use this gathering to think in terms of a series of get talks, sessions, workshops, people in smaller groups working in a room, working with each other, looking through the real nitty-gritties of writing and reading and thinking about texts. So that might be something other than the performances themselves, some pedagogical initiative that tries, where you get groups educating themselves and talking to each other, especially talking about formal elements in our writing practices, because those are so important, especially for people who are not thinking through the mainstream forms. You have very strong non-traditional forms, unconventional forms, radical forms, and all kinds of possibilities. And artists who work in these radical forums often feel they're all alone, and they all feel really isolated, and it's so great if they can share their formal anxieties and joys to each other. I think that could be something to think about.
That's great, Roy. It takes us back to the conversation with Lily and Alan early this morning. Lillian, you were thinking about the necessity of practice, right? And that sort of seems, yeah, to really hook in. What I would add to that, JL, it's so exciting that you're doing this. Yeah. How very cool, like how wonderful and magical. If I had something to add to that, I suppose, I mean, one of the things that I'm really perceiving at work, I'm thinking about, again, Shani this morning, thinking about institutions, that the way in which the institution has managed to, incorporate our work, our bodies, our faces, so effectively and against our will, often or partly, depending on what part of the self and what part of the self is willing. One of the things that it has done is evacuate the language of diversity, especially the justice aspects of it, specifically as they're connected to what Lily and Alan called roots this morning. So the recognition of the specific histories, the specific injustices, their materiality, all that stuff that we've been saying about the body, right, in its specificity and in its interactions with other bodies and other histories. I think it's that stuff that is what actually does the work of diversity. And we need to be really careful about more an easier to sell, shinier looking, sort of colored confetti idea of diversity where we just have lots of different pretty things, right? It's about connecting the specific work of the specific practitioner to a specific history, including the messy parts, I mean, especially the messy parts and the contradictory parts and the painful parts and the unsettling parts and the forgotten parts and all of those kinds of things. That's what will ground it, I think. And I would think of that kind of work as the enactment of a kind of ethics. And so that's where, institutions want to be able to name it, want to be able to put it into law, to have bylaws, constitutions, rules, regulations, protocols. Not the good kind of protocols, but I mean the kind that are designed to make power as it stands work better. And so we need to be attentive of when the language of race and racialization is being used to reproduce hegemonic, big daddy systems of power. And when that language is used to actually do the real work of liberation, by which I mean, connecting us to our histories, connecting us to one another, not destroying the earth, not destroying one another, not producing empowered, power positions for those who have traditionally held them. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And I guess the difficulty of the moment we're living in now is that the language of diversity really it can go in both directions. And so one needs to be ever attentive of it, is it spiraling up or is it spiraling out?
And this morning's panels is why I feel like I'm learning so much. I had a question sort of jumping off on the comments that Larissa's making on this acceleration of neoliberalism, and I want to tie it specifically to immigration policy, because that's obviously sort of the bedrock of a lot of racial policies, especially in Canada. And speaking as a new immigrant, and obviously being very moved by Madeline's earlier sharing, I wonder what you see the role, firstly, of new immigrant writers, activists, and critics who have come after the conference, maybe in the last 5 years to a decade? And secondly, does that help in sort of thinking beyond the nation? And how do you see the idea of race changing because of these new immigration policies?
That is such a fantastic question. And I'm not sure that I have much of an answer except for to say what a great question to ask. Okay, what is the role of newer immigrants who have arrived after the conference? I mean, I think that there are certain things, for sure, that are important that both Lee Maracle and Lenore Kishik Tobias talked about this morning, and that is the work of, really doing the research to recognize where you are and what it means to enter into, not just to immigrate to Canada, but to come to Turtle Island, to come to a land which is a place of complex interaction among multiple peoples, but with Indigenous people, here in this sort of prior position with that connection to land. So to me, that would be the most important thing. And then in terms of relationship to, this conference or people of color who are here as sort of members of earlier waves of immigration, sure, there's a responsibility to educate oneself in relation to that. I think it's also important to bring what you bring, though, right? Like if you've come, especially as an adult, from elsewhere, you bring what you bring and you think about what it is and its relationship to those complex histories. One of the things that's sort of been on my mind, Roy knows I've been working on this for way too long because my work life is too crazy. But my family actually comes from a wave of immigration that's sort of the earliest edge of the latest wave. So we're Hong Kong Chinese. A lot of people don't know that about me. They imagine me belonging to the Lo Wah Kiew, the old Chinese Canadian, but actually I'm not. And as more Hong Kong Chinese people have been sort of showing up here in the last 10, 20, 30 years, and I see myself and really understand, I can hear when they speak, I hear my family. One of the things that I'm hoping to do is kind of try to think through the relationship of that to the earlier waves and the different kinds of relationships to geohistory. Because, of course, the question you asked, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's connecting. So the relationship to, to newer immigration is also a relationship to a contemporary kind of globalized geohistory that's connected to the kind of newly empowered. So when we're talking about neoliberalism, I also think about all the sort of trade agreements, that began, I guess, mid-70s or so, but really accelerated with the Thatcher and Reagan era, right? And sort of all the free trade, the opening up, that has also enabled and problematized movements of bodies, especially racialized bodies, in really complicated ways. And so there's contributions. Sorry, it's a little rambly and imprecise because my thinking is not full on it, but does it help a little bit? Okay.
Yes, I was thinking earlier when Lee Maracle had mentioned the 800-year-old document that structures thinking about relationship in what was way prior to being Canada, but in this space that we live in. And I was wondering, to connect that to Roy Miki's question about what justice is currently and just relationships that we can have, and what does it mean for artists and scholars who are committed to decolonial projects to kind of situate that moment as like a basis for hospitality, a basis for work? What would it look like in practical terms, and what would it look like in philosophical terms?
Well, I would be interested in seeing the results in artistic practice of enacting this notion, the notion of justice as a verb and not a noun, and what the formal potentialities of that notion would be. I think needs to be followed through on. I get back. I'd like, Lillian, your idea about getting that sentence right. Yeah. That's it. I'd like to see a relationship between enactment of form and justice as a verb. And I'm interested in seeing what kind of material would be produced out of that particular notion, and I think it will help to transform us. I have a trust that we're one to push that through, that they would produce forms that would challenge us to change our way of thinking as it stands. That might be, for me, I think that formal elements and formal practices are the basis of theoretical possibilities as well. So I'd like to see the work produced and us kind of struggling to understand theoretically what this work is doing, and instead of trying to build theoretical models and trying to fit artistic works within them. So I'd like to see that anyways.
Any other questions or comments? Shani.
I think I can say it. It's just that, you know, like I recognize Roy and Miki.
Say it to the mic because of the recording. Thank you.
I recognize Roy and Miki from an old practice of making work. And so today is a lot of really, really important theoretical talk. But God, when I hear you all talk about like what to do in the work itself, in the artwork, in the writing, it just makes me want to cry, because that's the writing part of this. How do we do that work through this, you know, like framework of race that we are? So, thank you. Thanks.
Hi. So I had a question. When I was listening to the interview that Professor Roy did with CBC 20 years ago, it made me think about the ways in which power operate differently in different institutions, and how the body, or the racialized mark and body, is somehow identified and power enacted through that particular body. And I wanted to ask Professor Roy, from the media context, has the media changed, evolved in any way critically when it comes to subject of racialized bodies, issues of race, gender, especially right now, as someone who is a product of refugee, as a Somali Canadian, and as a diaspora, part of a diaspora Canadian community, the subject seemed to have shifted into the Muslim subject, this alien Muslim subject that is identified and targeted as something that is outside, or as Professor Razak says, evicted from the law, evicted from society, and how it's reflected on. So just a question that also for Larissa, how do you see the media right now comparatively to 20 years ago?
Well, I can respond with an example. It's just because I was thinking about this recently, and I'm remembering, George said I didn't include this in my book, but I did. The controversy around the W5 scandal. So the W5 scandal was a scandal that took place in the late 70s or very early 80s. Around, so it was an episode of a popular news program on CTV called W5, and this particular episode was called Campus Giveaway. And so in that sort of late 70s, early 80s moment, what they did, they sent a bunch of cameramen to University of Toronto, took a bunch of video of an orientation for Chinese Canadian students in the medical program to prepare them for entry into the program. And then broadcast the show that said that Asians were taking over Canadian universities. So there was a whole conflation, right, of Canadian students with Asian students, because the media couldn't imagine Canadians with faces like mine. More recently, there was a sort of an echo scandal at UBC. It's been dubbed the Two Asian scandal. And the scandal revolved around perception by some white students that there were too many Asian students on the UBC campus. But instead of saying too many Asian students, they said too many Asian and Asian Canadian students, it doesn't make that much difference to white students. So they could make a distinction now between Asian and Asian Canadian where they couldn't. But it doesn't matter because they all go into the same can anyway, and then you just, pour a little soy sauce on and it's all the same thing. I don't think so very much has changed. Maybe who is being demonized? Maybe the target communities have been changing, and you're right. Like, we're living in a moment of virulent anti-Muslim racism that's being, rolled out for us in contemporary media up and down the street like crazy without any nuance and in a fully racist way. So I'm not sure that much has changed. I don't know.
Question is actually around coalition building, and that was brought up by many of the speakers thus far. And I just want to say thank you for a wonderful gathering. First of all, it's so nice to remember those days. I'm not a writer, but I work in other media, and we were all sort of part of these similar discussions. And one thing I do remember from that time was this incredible sharing between various communities. And I have to say that was the point where I became a student of so many people who have experiences maybe different from myself. And I learned about so many issues. That's how I learned about, and I made so many friends. I've many friends in Indigenous communities who I still have to this day, who are just as dear to me as my own. Do you know what I mean? So it's and through the years we've deepened those knowledge bases, and I think that's, for me, one of the greatest values is that coalition. But one thing I have noticed is that the communities have not organized as much in coalition as they once did because of, I think, numbers changed. We spoke about that. And also just volume-wise. Like I went back to school recently as a student, and I took an Indigenous theory course with books that have just been written in the past 10 years, and I have to say it just felt like a huge privilege to be in that position. So my question, actually, I'm going to get to it, is that is there a role for more coalition spaces in the future? Do people see that?
I think you could answer that question. It would be interesting for me to hear what you have to say. Because when I was still teaching, I used to mention coalition building to a lot of my students, and they would all tell me over and over, we're not a generation of coalition builders. That's your generation. So they kept saying that there was previous generations were more interested in that language, but younger folks, younger artists and writers are worried about their careers and worried about making a living and worried about their individual lives, that they can't take on responsibilities in collaboration with coalition building with others. So I'm not sure, but on the other hand, there seems to be a call for coalition building being heard in different segments of the public spaces, and that may be something that is calling out for some formation. And I think the issues that are rising around residential school abuse, reconciliation issues, raises the whole question of the Canadian nation state and its status and its accountability and responsibility. That might filter down into arts communities in some certain way. I'm not sure, but maybe something will happen. I'm not sure. I can't answer that question.
Roy, would you be willing to comment on, maybe you wouldn't then just say, Larissa, piss off, and that's fine. Would you be willing to comment on some of the thinking that you've been doing around JC redress as it pertains to conversations with Indigenous folk around the politics of recognition and apology? Because that language is turning in curious ways, and I think that that is a kind of coalition work with the recognition of real histories that have been endured by two very different communities, and yet the similar languages are being deployed to different kinds of ends by the same state. Isn't that a kind of coalition work? And if it is, how does it work?
It may be. I'm not sure that large numbers of people in particular groups are banding together, or whether it's just a number of individuals who seem to constitute some kind of a group are coming together and probing some of these issues to turn over the language of justice, the language of reconciliation. And David Garneau, is he here? David, is he? He was talking about the word he likes to use is conciliation. And so right away, when he mentions that, we're standing in the hallway talking, I'm already thinking that's another interesting word that I have to grapple with and think about. He thinks it's more important that we use the word conciliation, and that has to make me start. So that's the kind of nascent moment I think we are in thinking through these things. It's easy to just kind of move past them and say, oh, we compensated residential school students, that's enough. They must be healed by now. This kind of stuff. This is like, let's get on. But what are we getting on to? What is the thing that we're getting on to? It is still the moment, the historical moment of consciousness of ourselves and our body thinking about how to change the world that we're in. There's the beyond is always in the present. The future is really now. It always has been. But these fantasies of getting beyond, we want to get beyond this so everybody will be happy, and therefore we could just keep digging for more oil. Like that's what a lot of people say, let's get over environmental problems so we can get back to the oil. And they always think the oil prices are going to come back up again or whatever. That there's always this idea that around the corner is a solution that will close off all the problems of the world, but they don't go away. And that's the fantasy of neoliberalism, right? That is the discourse of globalization that has trained people to think that a state has been achieved that has not been achieved, and that the language of achievement is always the language of a particular form of closure. And it takes us out of the practice of living, and that's so important. And in the practice of living, form is always generating other forms and giving birth to new ideas and so on. At that level, it's a wonderful world, right? The world of generation and generative thought. But we're dealing with the pedagogical systems that want to complete human experience and put it in a box. And that box is a commodity. And so people are always saying, what are you as a commodity? Writers being forced to brand themselves. So there is a voice that this writer has, and if they don't write in that voice, they sort of say, Shani, it doesn't sound like a Mutu. That's what you're talking about, I think, because there's a branding and there's a Mutu vision of the world that has to operate. And if it's not operating, something's wrong with the world. It's not me, right? But that's the institution of commodities speaking back to you. So I think it's really important that we be attentive to everything around us and be very careful about the language we use.
So that's a real example of the use of a social justice term in the end towards really conservative ends, right? Yeah. The work of reconciliation with Indigenous people turns out to just grab even more stuff from Indigenous people than has already been grabbed. When JCs were fighting for reconciliation, it seemed, and I still think, well, that's the question, isn't it? Is the thing that was fought for and won the thing that you thought you were fighting for and won?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Oh. Say that again.
So the thing that you fought for, what do you do when the thing that you fought for and the thing that you fought for and won turns out not to be the thing that you fought for and won?
Yeah, I've always said, and I've written about this, for minorities in particular, if you win, you lose. If you win, you lose. And that's that's again this whole thing of living within a liberal society in which forms are constituted on the basis of the erasure of historical injustices. And that's the way liberalism has always worked. And liberalism constitutes itself and sort of says, we're all free. When we know we're not all free in the same kind of way. But we are free individuals. We get to choose between Coke and Pepsi. That's a major moment in capitalism, right? When they ask you, will it be a Coke or a Pepsi? It's up to you. Will you have Samsung or Apple? I don't know. What should I do? Well, read this app. Use this app and find out whether it's... And on and on and on, right? The choices we're made in commodity culture are the choices between commodities. We don't have to say, I want to go into a post-commodity cultural state. Can you feed me that instant? Well, no, we can't, because the economy will falter and we'll all lose our jobs and there will be no more oil to extract. And on, right? The doomsday scenario is when your car won't start because there's no more gas. And that's a horrible state for most people.
The other piece of that, Roy, this is to add really, is that we do have other freedoms besides the freedom to choose, things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, all of that. But we have them, thinking about Sonnet's question, only as long as we don't use them, right? And as soon as you go to use it, actually you go to court, right? We're going to sue you for $1 million and use your poem as evidence against you. So you have freedom of speech as long as you don't use it for something real. You have freedom of association as long as you don't try to gather First Nations people and people of color together, right? Isn't that?
But I still like this notion that art liberates, art practice is a form of liberation. We can't give up on that positive side of the production of art and creativity, because if we lose on the creative side, we might as well shut the doors, put the curtains in the closet, and go home.
Art liberates. I think on that note, it's an appropriate note to end this session. Please give a round of applause, Larissa.